Good evening, my brothers and sisters. And my name is Father Matt Malone. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of America Media, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this presentation on Principle and Practice, René Girard and Violence and Politics. A few housekeeping matters before we proceed. If you could, we invite you to fill out the info sheets that have been provided on your seats. It's always helpful to know who takes an interest in these things and how you found out about us. That would be tremendously helpful. And there are also blank note cards, index cards on your seats. Those are for questions. So if you would, throughout the presentations, if you'd like to pose a question, please just write it down on the card, and someone will be wandering up and down the side aisles here. You can hand it to them. This is an evening that has that is of great personal appeal to me. I have for a good number of years been a student of René Girard and, of course, of James Allison. In fact, I have come to really rely on this insight of René Girard, the French-American Catholic cultural critic who died last year at the age of 91. And you're going to hear tonight from two of the most distinguished Girardians in the English-speaking world who will tell you all about this theory. But in a nutshell, Girard's insight is that all human desire is mimetic, that apart from fundamental biological needs, human beings copy one another, and not just in basic linguistic and behavioral patterns, but in terms of what we consciously want. So strictly speaking, he says, I have no desires that are original to me. I rather desire according to the desire of another. And Girard's second insight is that human conflict occurs when the desires of multiple people converge on the same object, either seen, that thing, or unseen, happiness. And third, that this conflict that ensues, which he calls mimetic rivalry, quickly escalates and can plunge an entire community into crisis. Such crises are resolved through what Girard calls the scapegoat mechanism. One person and then another, and then a whole group of people point the finger of suspicion at a single individual, the sacrificial victim, who is then expelled or destroyed. And the sacrifice of the scapegoat restores order to the community until the next crisis. And admittedly, if that were all Girard had to tell us, it would be pretty grim news. For we are, by nature, not free in the way that we thought, and worse, that we are prone to rather brutal forms of violence. And perhaps we intuited all of that. But the good news is that there is a way out. And we see it in the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the words of one student of Girard, Michael Kerwin of the Society of Jesus, the gospel is the biblical spirit, pardon me, that exposes the truth of violent origins, takes the side of the victim, and works toward the overcoming of scapegoating as a viable means of social formation. In other words, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus subvert the whole ghastly enterprise of human rivalry and violence. This is the theory that we are here tonight to explore together. And we do so, of course, in memory of René Girard, who over the course of his lifetime was really a bright light in the humanist Christian tradition. Our first speaker this evening will be James Allison, a Catholic theologian, a priest, and author who earned his doctorate in theology from the Jesuit faculty in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. He has studied, lived, and worked in Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and the United States, as well as his native England. A systematic theologian by training, Father Alison has developed Jesus the Forgiving Victim, a program of induction into the Christian faith for adults, following on from the insight into desire that is associated with René Girard's thought. I have known, I think, James, for almost 20 years now, And I can tell you with great confidence that he is simply one of the greatest theologians in the English-speaking world today. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Duncan Morrow. Dr. Morrow holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of Ulster. He is currently the Director of Community Engagement at the University of Ulster, responsible for developing the university's partnerships with group organizations across the community. And he also serves as a lecturer in politics. He has served as the Chief Executive of the Community Relations Council, where he championed the concept of a shared future and developed the Council's role in research and active learning in policy development. He has also been appointed as Chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Tackling Sectarianism for the Scottish Government, serving in that role from 2012 to 2013. You will, of course, see from these introductions that there is a method in our madness. We have decided to bring together two people who can afford us not only a brief education about Girard's theory, but how the theory actually plays out in practice. The moderator of tonight's discussion is Sheelah Hidden, who's a research associate at Heythrop College in London, who really is to be especially thanked for arranging tonight's lecture. It was through her work that America, along with Imitatio, which seeks to press forward the Girardian enterprise, came up with this evening's program. She is a friend, and I've known her since, together with Dr. Michael Kerwin, we helped to start the Center for the Study of René Girard's thought at Heythrop College in London. This event is currently being live streamed and will be available for viewing following tonight's discussion. I sincerely hope that you enjoy this evening's discussion and similarly look forward to your questions. And I would now like to invite Sheelah Hidden to come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good evening. I think I can speak for James and Duncan and myself. We are delighted to be here in this beautiful place to talk about such a burning topic, such an important topic today. And in a little, is that better?
There you are.
Yes. It's a delight to be here and to be able to speak to you about this burning topic, this wonderful genius of a man whom we all knew well, and in such august surroundings. Our program this evening will be rather to stimulate you, where each of our speakers will speak for only 20 minutes. And at the end, we've decided to have all the questions at the end, and we'd like it to be a very vibrant, well, I'm sure it will be a very vibrant discussion, hence our pencils and what have you we're giving you there. We reverse the order that Matt spoke of. Duncan will speak first, followed by James. And Duncan's intention is to explore the key insights of René Girard's thought and to indicate to you how it formed his experience in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I wish you all an excellent evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming. Actually, the fact that you're interested is remarkable. I feel as if I should take some advice that I understand the Dalai Lama gave the Pope, which is before you speak to an audience, you take a sense of who it is you're speaking to. I have to say, you're a rough-looking crowd. I also feel it's a bit of an intellectual supermarket here we're in, slightly, which is that you're in that territory of buy one, get one free, and I'm afraid I'm the get one free. But you know it's the bonus that you didn't know you were coming for. Or it might be the thing you put at the back of the cupboard when you go home and don't quite take out again, as they say, buy one, throw one out. But first of all, I suppose I want to say I'm really delighted that we are here together. These insights, this thinking that comes from the work of René Girard has been so influential for me that the opportunity at any time simply to engage other people for whom it might be as useful, as important, as interesting is always for me a huge privilege. And so I suppose I want to say to you this, which is I am an academic, I work in the university, although I spent really the majority of my time living where I do in Belfast, trying to work out what on earth do we do to make our society move forward. I live in a very small, on the edge kind of a place, I suppose, but it has become synonymous in many ways, particularly in the Christian world, for people unable to find their way past historic enmity, and yet somehow or other wrestling with it to try to find what would reconciliation mean. So I have lived in the middle of that and worked in the middle of that, almost with this as my core question. What is it that we can do? How do we understand what's going on, and what would be useful if we really do want to build communities which are open and have a future and are not simply based on excluding or driving out those with whom we feel that we have no common space. So for me, this is intensely practical and personal. And actually, I'm absolutely sure that one of the core elements of mimetic theory is this isn't just a head exercise. This only works if it starts to make sense of that which we are living ourselves. And so the translation of that has been very important for me. And before I go on, and I will go on to do what Sheelah asked me to do, but I just want to say that there's no straight line from Girard to practical intervention. It doesn't tell you what to do. It's not a recipe. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, at some level or other, some of the practical people struggle with Girard. But what it does do is it gives us a totally new place to see from, and a totally new understanding of where we are and who we are and what it is that we might be called to do which might make a difference. With that in mind, what I'm going to do tonight is at least give some insight of how I understand this work, and you've already had a quick introduction which might actually even be clearer than what I'm going to say, and then try to talk a little bit about some of the implications that I've seen by way of introduction. We can't cover this in more than 20 minutes in anything other than a schematic way, but I hope that it's at least of some use. Girard's fundamental insight is that relatedness is at the root of who we are, and that he calls the way in which that relatedness works itself out mimesis. It's a Greek word. It's obviously the root of mimicry, imitation, and so on. And what at some fundamental level he says, we learn, we become into our humanity by imitation, by emulation, by copying. First as small infants, of course, in the unself-conscious learning of eating, of walking and speaking and relying on others for safety or not. That which we come into the world with is nurtured in relationship with the world as we meet it, mediated by those closest to us, our mothers, our families, our surroundings. But I need to say something to you. In the Girardian world, this isn't just an idea. We are mimetic. We are in these relationships. We are being shaped in these relationships far before we are conscious. That's why we don't say imitation. A child doesn't say, I'm just going to copy my mother. The child copies his or her mother. Mimetic relationship, this mimicry of others, this reaction, positive and negative, is so deep, so foundational, that we should speak of it less as an idea and as conscious copying or mimicry than as a kind of magnetism or gravity. What Girard is speaking about is a reality in the midst of our becoming, which is absolutely foundational to who we are as people, way before we think about it. That's one of the dangers of dealing with this topic in the intellectual framework. We think of it as something which we think first and do second. Actually, it's something we do first, and then maybe, if we're lucky, we make sense of it in our life because we see the pattern. So, Girard's revolutionary insight wasn't just to say we learn from each other. But it was to extend this notion of mimesis from simply the growing up process, if you like, to include desire. We learn what to want, what to be from our models. Contrary to what our modern culture tells us, we don't come into the world wanting to be a fireman or to want a washing machine or to be a great singer. We acquire our desires in relation to all that is around us, all that is innocent and around us, most profoundly from those closest to us. For Girard, mimesis of desire is therefore a dynamic reality in the centre of human life. While this is simply a matter of adopting or adapting from our models, this looks like learning. But what Girard also discovered was that mimetic desire is also at the heart of our conflicts. Because I desire what you have, you desire it more. Because you desire it more, I desire it more. And so on, and so on. Quickly, if we're not careful, desire pulls us into relationships where we're not simply learners from one another, models if you like, but also rivals. The more we are in mimetic relationship with each other, the greater the risk of conflict and eventually of violence and escalating patterns of competition and revenge. At a micro level, you can see this where two children sit in a room filled with toys where the desire of both converges on the same object, even though there's hundreds of toys there, precisely because the other wants it. I wish it too. On one level, it's a banal example, if widespread. But once you see how desire operates, you see how all-pervasive it is. Think of advertising and the whole celebrity and fashion world. Why buy this or that product? Because through it, I too might, at least in part of me, be like Brad Pitt or Clint Eastwood or Beyonce. Think of the attempt to encourage children through role models. We even use it. The problem arises, however, if desires of this sort are uncontrolled. What if relationships between adults, between groups of adults, have the same tendency to converge in the same object? What if the desire of one escalates the desire of the other until both parties converge together in a spiral of reciprocal obsession? All of a sudden, uncontrolled mimetic desire is transformed from learning into rivalry, setting off a pattern of escalation, reciprocal tit for tat, escalating, if it's not stopped, into explosive violence. Girard postulates that mimetic relationships therefore both define us as human beings, but they're also the unstable heart of humanity. For rivals, the potential for violence, especially contagious spiral of revenge, poses a huge risk to human survival. Of all the animals, our potential for mimetic rivalry is the most unlimited. Perhaps now you're beginning to see why Girard's insights matter and why they are such a challenge to our thinking. Girard's work suggests that finding ways to control the potential for contagion, for the spread of unlimited violence, to control the potential for contagion, to control the spread of unlimited violence is a central requirement of human survival, no less. And you will also start to see that the implications of this are not minor, but have huge ramifications for how we understand ourselves as human beings, how we think about our experiences, and how we move forward into the future. Because the truth is that relatedness is the defining reality of human experience. Let me just put that another way. There is no being human on our own. We are human in relationship. According to Girard, and I entirely agree with him, we are not the fixed and firmed and formed individuals, fixed from the beginning, but persons whose unique being in the world is constituted by our relationships, past and present, known and unknown, physical, spiritual, natured and nurtured. Who we are depends on who and how we are related. Our questions about human persons and human communities are therefore always not just who are we, but what is the nature and the quality of our relationships, with whom and with what fruits. Change in human affairs is not so much a question of fixed agreements between fixed people and structures and policy, but can only happen if it is a change in our relationships. In gospel terms, metanoia, turning around. Modernity, which gives us the impression that we are formed on our own, by ourselves, and on our own, is in fact for me now a dangerous delusion, a deeply romantic illusion with serious consequences. Because if we are formed in relationships and change in relationships, then the only questions are, who are our models? Who do we follow? And how are we shaped? The question is not so much who are we or who am I, but whose are we? Modern atheism and Enlightenment philosophy poses the question, God or not God? The ancient Hebrews and Girard asked a different question. The question is, which God? You don't get out of having a model. The only question is, who is it? For them, escaping the mastery of another in your life was not a possibility. What the miracle of the desert revealed was that there was another reality, a God who saves, outside the manipulation of human power, beyond the Pharaoh's reach, who loves his children. And apart from that, all the other gods were violent. Girard is therefore a radical challenge to everything that our modern society tells us about self-realization, self-fulfillment, and, as we talked about yesterday, forgiving ourselves. Girard returns us to the beginning by denying that human autonomy has any reality. Everything and everyone depends on our being, on relationships. So, that's the first one. And it is unbelievably radical, because it means the other is not just our enemy. The other is the basis of our life together. We belong to each other in complex and important ways. Second of all, having identified the first foundational issue, relatedness and the human mimesis of desire, Girard's second question tackled the consequences of the first. If our desire converge into rivalry and obsession, how has humanity survived? His answer, established through a reading of literature and anthropology, was that human survival was made possible when the desires of all converged in a single person or target. The convergence of desires has a paradoxical effect. The driving out of the person at the centre of the rivalry created a unanimity for everyone else. As a consequence, the driving out of the victim was the route to the new social harmony. Or put the other way, the new social harmony only emerged because we drove out the victim. Because the desires of all converged on one, there was no more rivalry. The consequence of all against one was the miraculous appearance of social peace. Of course, none of this was conscious to the participants, but what they did know was that violence had been transformed into peace through the agency of the mimetic frenzy directed against one. Furthermore, this transformation was so incredible that the victim must have been the one who also brought peace. Girard postulates that humanity became possible because of the enormity of the experience. From this experience, and this is a huge element of the discussion, came what we call culture, which for Girard was co-identical with religion. The social mechanism for peace based on the unanimity of the crowd against one. Culture was then maintained and grew through the repetition of sacred ritual, through the telling of foundation stories as told from the perspective of the crowd, which Girard calls myths, through the new social order, which was given a sacred being, and through the laws which arose. But at its heart is the lie, or the misapprehension. Social peace was bought at the cost of the sacrifice of the scapegoat. Our peace rests on violence. The good people, us, have our assurance of goodness against a scapegoat. Our being in culture rests on a hypocrisy. Part of the scandal of Girard appears to take place because of the very elegance of the hypothesis. But the evidence for mimetic desire, of scapegoating, of buying our peace by projecting on others, is pretty substantial in the 21st century. The second part of the scandal appears to be Girard's final assertion that the primary vehicle for the revelation of this mechanism underlying our culture has been through the Judeo-Christian revelation. In his work, Girard explores the extent to which Jewish faith records the emergence of a people whose God is not that of the crowd, but a mysterious God who is outside of culture and whose concern is for the victims. This intuition and experience, visible throughout the Hebrew Bible as constant to and fro between unknowing and recognition, that comes for Girard at least to its central epiphany in the New Testament, and above all in the person of Jesus. In Jesus, the nature of God is made manifest in the world, and the scapegoat mechanism and our complicity with it is unmasked. Instead of peace made in opposition to a scapegoat other and rooted in violence, Jesus takes the place of the scapegoat, the unique foundational victim on the cross, and offers us forgiveness and the possibility of a different kind of peace, made visible above all in the Eucharist, in which God sacrifices himself for us rather than the other way around, and by faith that emerges in the resurrection, the endless vista of loving relationship. In this regard, Girard understands himself as carrying forward a revolution in human affairs which has already been present, but has been subject to the same to and fro of unknowing and yet recognition and misrecognition among the Christians that was the lot of the Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible. The alternative, the new possibility, and this is critical, is not that we jump out of mimetic relationship, but we have someone else with whom to be mimetic. The model who does not rival. The possibility out of our dependence on violence is not a romantic identification of the bad guys or a single institution or a new myth. The gospel imperative is, follow me. In Girardian terms, come into mimesis with me, and that is your freedom. But that following takes place in a world which is founded in the revelation of our complicity, on the possibility of forgiveness, and the promise that if we do, we will find ourselves in the kingdom. I'm not going to go into this in detail now, in part because that's James's expertise, but it's important to note that the call to follow Jesus is a universal one, but that it is distinct from a project to violently convert all of the earth to our way of thinking and being. So while Girard resolutely restores Jesus to the centre of human affairs, he does so in a way which, for me anyway, is as deeply uncomfortable for Christianity and Christians as it is for everybody else. What I do want to say something about is how this had any relevance to the world in which I live. I live in Northern Ireland, a small place, as I said, on the edge of a small continent, but one in which violence and the search for peace has been a central part of public life for centuries. To call it a battle between Catholic and Protestant or British and Irish is not wrong, but it's misleading if it distracts us from the central issue. It is a fight to find peace in a place where no peace is apparently available without the defeat of my neighbour. Every road to peace with justice leads through victory. We, the defiled and the good, must prevail over our evil opponents. And yet all that it has done is drag us endlessly into further rounds of reciprocal violence. In recent years, this pattern of reciprocal violence became visible, and many parties began to explore what it might mean to find another way. In a way that's unusual, the public discussion about peace became framed as a matter of reconciliation. The statement of the necessity of changing relationships was in itself remarkable. Making it happen has proved more difficult. While we could agree that violence itself was counterproductive, a lasting peace depends not just on an absence, not violence, but on a presence. Reconciliation is not an absence, but a presence which is only possible if we find a way back to each other in which we move out of the categories of them and us, of goodies and baddies, and find our way back to one another. Reconciliation is thus a very difficult word for politics, because reconciliation in this sense is a radical disruption of the logic of action and reaction and rivalry for power. A break in the change of revenge enables a new relationship. And because of that new relationship, in which revenge is no longer thinkable, the truth of what we did to one another emerges. Far from being romantic, reconciliation is always a shocking apocalypse of both mercy and truth. Generosity shines a more penetrating and unbearable light on our complicity with violence than conflict. But the requirement for mercy and the spotlight of unflinching truth means that reconciliation hardly ever enters the world of the realistic, except when every other option is exhausted, as the last chance saloon and salvation of the exhausted, the despairing and the lost, not the romantic triumph of rational peace building. Reconciliation is much easier to support when it is others who are called to embrace their enemy. This kind of peace is a far cry from the limited but management goal of equating peace with the absence of violence. But in societies where peace requires both stopping killing and making a future together, negative peace is little more than a volatile truce. Reconciliation points to a new relationship where partners find ways both to make promises and to forgive failings. The action that Hannah Arendt identified as the foundations of human freedom and political trust. Precisely because it can't be enforced, negotiated or legislated, reconciliation remains both fragile and essential. To forgive and be forgiven is a leap of faith in the possibility of a fresh start with the antagonistic other that can only be hoped for, imagined and rumoured until it is made real by concrete actions and gestures. To promise in a world where no promise except hostility has been kept is a moment of extreme vulnerability for any political leadership. Leadership for reconciliation is potentially costly and self-sacrificial and always high risk. I can't dwell on the full implications of the peace process. What I want to say is that Northern Ireland suggests that the real challenge to all of us is that we can no longer pursue peace through the ways of culture, excluding the other, uniting on a shared identity in our foes. But our challenge now to a new possibility, one that returns us to a more fundamental choice. And I want to make two final points, if that's all right. Is it okay? About Girard and his work on revealing violence, which I hope are of relevance. Many people comment that Girard is impractical, that he holds no solutions, that he can't be applied. On one level, if we are still looking in the same place for a recipe in culture, the critics are absolutely right. Here is no formula, no theory of international relations, no instant doctrine of state. But at another level, I believe him to be wholly wrong. In practice, what Girard reveals is this: peace is not just another social contract, legal formula, or structural solution. While form and structure and law have their place, they remain rooted in the failing scapegoat mechanisms, whose workings are now so visible as to render them almost worthless. The cry of hypocrisy now impedes every effort to support peace. But what Girard says is this: peace depends on a new relationship. Peace now means a form of radical conversion, from the assumption of goodness to the acceptance of complicity, from the assertion of power to the reliance on forgiveness. Of course, in practice, the meaning of this has to be worked through, thought to, witnessed to. But the central point is this: efforts to rely on peace built on scapegoating are likely to become less and less effective and more dependent on the imposition of ever more monstrous violence. That seems to me to be a global reality. Finding our way out of this predicament is a critical task for our time. Secondly, and finally, Girard tells us that the paradoxical consequence of the revelation of the scapegoat mechanism is both the opening of a new world through Jesus and the removal of our primary past vehicle for peace until now, scapegoating a victim. In his final years, he became convinced that the consequence was both the spreading of greater and greater uncertainty as the structures in which social difference are built began to shake, and then, on the other side, the demand for change. While Western liberalism has operated on the basis that the conflict of ideas and people and classes was leading to final reconciliation and enlightenment, Girard warned that unless we find a way outside of our mimetic rivalry, this would unleash an escalation towards new extremes that can only be resolved by a refusal of escalation and only itself be resolved by coming into mimesis with another reality. The global situation we face of uncertainty, dislocation, anger and insecurity, as the structures which have held whole states and nations together appear to falter, suggests that structures alone will not resolve this. Reconciliation, the possibility of change, the faith that violence will not have the last word, all of a sudden appears not as religious fantasy, but as the possibility of hope in a dangerous world. And it also says to me that Girard is the critical practical voice in revealing this, and that in suggesting a pathway of how we might move forward, no matter how scandalised we are by its return to our reliance on our model in Jesus or in the forgiving victim. It remains the only thing worth pursuing. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Duncan. Duncan and I first met aged 19. We were contemporaries at university together, many years ago. Such is the small world. Neither of us. Had you heard of René Girard then? Yeah. Likewise. So here we are, many years later. How's volume? Okay, speak a little bit up. Wave hands if I lapse into my... Okay, good. I just want to stress one of the key points which Duncan made, just as to allow it to sink in. Jesus being put to death as someone who fit into the old-fashioned scapegoating model whereby we point the finger at whoever is the bad guy, we think is the bad guy, the person whom it suddenly becomes convenient to get rid of so that we can all get on together. That Jesus fitting into that pattern in the midst of the priestly and temple structure of religion gave the richness of the language which has allowed us to develop this more fully. Because once he had gone to his death and shown up what goes on when we in fact do that, we gather together and point, saying, yep, you do that, and it doesn't work. You're actually falsely accusing someone who is either innocent or no more guilty than you. So at the very best, what you're doing is putting a piece of sticking plaster over your group conflicts, which will last just for a little bit. Do you say sticking plaster? Yeah, over your group conflicts, just for a little bit. But they'll break out again soon enough, unless you learn to play a different game. So what I'm here to do is to teach you to play a different game. But notice that the way that he's teaching people to learn to play a different game is by pulling the plug on the old game, which is very dangerous, because it means that there is no longer an easy resolution to problems with which we can agree wholeheartedly. Every time we gang up against some bunch of undesirables, before long, the suspicion begins to break out that maybe they are in the place of Jesus. And therefore that we are, whoops, not the good guys, but the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, the Romans. In other words, that we've been in this drama before and we're on the wrong side of it. In other words, one of the terrifying effects, if you like, of the Christian revelation, the bringing into the open of the Jewish revelation, the bringing to us Gentiles of the Jewish revelation, one of the terrifying effects of it is bringing to an end the easy resolution. Before, while people could still believe in the guilt of the victims who they were driving out, it was effectively possible to say, society's in a bad way, it's all falling apart. Let's, well, build a wall to keep them out, or whatever the... or stop them coming in the first place, or whatever. And for people actually to believe it. In other words, stop the world, I want to get off, was a valid option.
I want them to get off.
Sorry?
Stop the world,
I want them to get off. But the notion that you can close down and start again in a peaceful, quiet space which will be created by throwing someone out, that's gone. So the question becomes navigating the incredibly difficult space of contagious mimetic desire, which has only grown over the millennia. And there are wonderful books, for those of you who are interested, by followers of Girard and others, showing exactly how this has worked out. Some of you will have heard of Charles Taylor's book on secularization, in which he recognizes very greatly his debt to Girard in his understanding of the development of the modern individual in the process of secularization. There's a brilliant new book out by Paul Dumichel, a Canadian who teaches in Canada, giving some elements of, if you like, the political and social science understanding of the shifts that have led to the collapse of the old forms of solidarity and the birth of indifference, as we've learnt not to take part in hot solidarity, because hot solidarity so quickly turns us into lynchers. But instead of, as it were, recreating gentle forms of solidarity that might help each other, we become indifferent. We've only learnt half of the part. Oh, they're just victims of the economic order. They're just victims of social change. I haven't done them any harm. You see what I mean? Whereas the notion that there were people in a highly solidary ancient society, the notion that there were some people who were just affected by other things would have been intolerable. If you have a warm, welcoming society, you also have one that's likely to be a victimizing one. But it's unlikely to be an indifferent one. So the process is described. And from a more literary perspective, there are several beautiful books by Cesario Bandera. They're written in English, actually, so you can get them in English. His name is Spanish. Describing the literary developments with which many of you will be familiar, showing how this has worked out from the end of the classical period, from Virgil, right the way through to the birth of the modern novel and our beginnings of understanding ourselves as modern individuals. So the background to this is all available. The question arises, how now do we survive the contagious frenzy? And Lord Alone knows we've got enough of it. I mean, your news cycle has been dominated by what is clearly a mimetic freak show. Our news cycle in Europe is dominated by the same thing. They're very slight variations of the same theme, but it's not as though that there are anyone who's particularly good or particularly bad in this. And the question is, how are we not going to be run by it? Well, of course, the first reaction is to think, well, I'm one of the good guys, so how could I be run by it? That means that almost certainly you fall at the first post because you'll get sucked up into the thing that you've been standing up against. Senator Lindsey Graham anywhere around here? I don't know. He managed to denounce very truthfully the things and then mysteriously seems to have, well, you know how the story goes. But this is the case with all of us. This is the case with all of us. We are all liable to find ourselves complicit with the contagion, particularly because so much of the contagion is attractive. It's fun. It gives us a sense of spark, of enjoyment. I mean, I'm as bad as they come in this. I take huge entertainment out of outrage at whatever the latest, crazy thing has gone on. Taking huge entertainment out of outrage is being as mimetic as they come. It makes me as bad as the people I'm outraged about. It means that I'm failing to get a life. Have any of you been there? Yeah, okay. Well, failing to get a life, in a sense. The whole purpose of what we're talking about here is, how do we get a life? And here is where I'd like to just have a look at one or two key passages from the Gospels which seem to have been written understanding this world of mimetic contagion. It really is quite extraordinary. The Sermon on the Mount comes to an end. It says, "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, not as their scribes." But curiously, if you read what he had said in the previous 2 or 3 chapters, he's not laying down the law. He's not being very apodictic. He's actually giving a whole series of very small, little pieces of advice about very banal, ordinary things, like anxiety and anger and looking at somebody lustfully. In other words, it's all very day to day. There's no attempt to come down from the mountain and whoop, lay down the law. He's not doing Charlton Heston in drag. It's much more modest than that. But the extraordinary thing is that in every case, he understands exactly how mimetic we are, how we are reflexive beings. As we do to others, we are in fact doing to ourselves. Let me just give you one little example of this, because it's one of those passages that just sounds silly when we hear it. Okay, here's Matthew 5:21. "You have heard that it was said to the people of old, 'Thou shalt not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment.' Okay? But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother or sister shall be liable to judgment. Whoever calls his brother Raka shall be liable to the council, to the Sanhedrin. And whoever says, 'You fool,' in Greek, more, shall be liable to the hell of fire." So here we have a strange escalation. Jesus starts with, "You shall not kill," they all knew that. And Jesus says, being angry is the equivalent of killing. That's his first step. Everyone who's angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. It faces the same judgment. In other words, guess what? We're all murderers here. It's a good thing to remember that, so that we don't feel too pious when faced with lifers who have actually been sent to prison for murder. But I say to you that he says, whoever calls his brother Raka. That's very odd. Why would the Greek New Testament keep that word in the Hebrew or Aramaic? Raka, no one knows exactly what it means. It might have been a general term insult. It might have been faggot. It might have been son of a bitch. But, as it were, the kind of insult that you cast out like that. But they keep it in the Hebrew. Why? Because at least it's talking to one of us. If it's son of a bitch, it's but one of our son of a bitch. Yeah? And therefore the judgment is within the group. It goes to the Supreme Court because this is a serious murder charge, but it's within the group. But if you call someone more, which means if your insult to them pushes them out of the group, you're effectively victimizing them. You are effectively lynching them. And you have cast yourself into their place. You yourself are the one who in fact are being cast out. Do you see the absolute symmetry that he's teaching? As you do, so in fact you do to yourself. Provided your insult is a within the group insult, at least you have stayed within the same ballgame. But if you start insulting people as though they were part of an outside group, I don't know, Mexicans or Muslims or Syrians or whoever it is, well then you have in fact cast yourself out already. you see how extraordinary the mimetic structure? That explains why the word is left in Hebrew there. Because the whole point of it is that for Jesus' audience it was an inside word, whereas the word which is simply translated as foolish in Greek, more, is left in Greek, but for them it was the outsider's word. You're one of them, not one of us at all. So we're casting you out. Do you see that he understands exactly the way in which this violence works? And, of course, the significance of words. Now, for me at least, one of the really difficult things that we face in the middle of the contagion of this sort of build-up to violence, anger, insults, casting each other out, which Lord alone knows is we have plenty of opportunity to be involved in, and which we have plenty of opportunity to find our complicity in. One of the difficult things to find in the midst of all this is the voice of authority. Who speaks with authority? If we're good Catholics, we can say, well, of course, the Holy Father. Except, as you probably have noticed, the so-called really good Catholics have been busy denying everything the Holy Father. They've suddenly gone all soft on him. Yes. And it's curious, there was actually an article in a Spanish periodical I read today which was commenting on the ways in which people are handling Amoris Laetitiae. And it was interesting that the family groups that have worked with family, but the ones related to some, let's say, some right-wing groups that were nameless, instead of saying, well, we may disagree with some parts of it, but actually there are some rather splendid bits that really help us deal with relationships, and the hymn to love, the reading of St. Paul's hymn to love, and actually the discussion of how couples relate to each other and couples counselling is better than anything you've seen in most papal documents for the last several hundred years, in terms just of ability to talk to real people where they are. So we can take that and run in our group. But guess what? Those same groups aren't pleased with that at all. As though it was only the chance of being able to use the documents against people that made them like this whole business of family anyhow. And now when someone comes along to them and offers them a positive account of family in all its messitude, and trying to encourage people to, well, start where we are and recognize that not everything is perfect, but usually most situations can be made a little bit better. Someone taking that kind of line, oh, well, they're horrified with that because they no longer have a weapon. In other words, how much idolatry is there in our goodness? The dangerousness of our good is what is terrifying here. With the result that it becomes hugely important for us to work out how we hear the voice of the master. The one master who says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them. He's saying something very specific there. He's saying, people will be able to recognize that it really is me, independently of whatever avatars put themselves around and call themselves me. And it will be something rather special, the quality of voice. And St. Mark suggests something about that quality of voice, because when he has the disciples and Jesus on the Mount of Olives, just in the few days before the Passion, he has Jesus looking at the temple and making a prediction. And he's urging them to keep vigilant. And he says, keep vigilant because, all of this is going to be shaken. Everything is going to be shaken. The whole of the New Testament depends, in fact, on Jesus giving advice to people who are going to be living in a completely shaken world, in a world in which the centre will not hold, and the lines about the good lacking all conviction and the worst being infused with passionate uncertainty, intensity, that's right, that's Yeats. That was presupposed in Jesus' farewell speech. That's the world that he was talking about. He says, none of you know when the Son of Man comes, whether in the evening, at midnight, at cockcrow, or in the morning. But I tell you, this generation will not pass before all these things come to pass. Okay, so he's telling them that if they want to see the one who is going to be the source of stability, the source of authority, in the midst of this mayhem, then it's by being stretched towards someone who, in the evening, is going to give himself away. Para dose, he's going to give himself away. At midnight, he is going to be betrayed, exactly the same verb. At the cock's crow, he's going to be betrayed again, the same word. And at midday, in the morning, he's going to be handed over by the Sanhedrin to the Romans, same verb. In other words, this is the most bizarre thing, that at the center of the Christian proclamation is the notion that it's by fixing our attention to the one who is in the process of being betrayed, denied, handed over, giving himself, that we are, all of which sound like the most precarious places to be, and mostly not recognizable as good at all, since typically if someone's being handed over, well, they must have done something wrong. Hence, Jesus has said, if you give a cup of water to such a person, you'll have a prophet's reward, because you will have seen what was really going on. You will have broken through the lie that that person was being properly accused. In other words, that the true source of authority is the one who is apparently occupying this incredibly slippery ground, and you will be being nudged into stretching out towards that person, developing habits of being stretched towards such people in all their precariousness. And in doing so, this is the bizarre thing, immediately before the passage of St. Matthew where it talked about Jesus teaching with all authority, it then says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof, to resort to King James. The wonderful imagery, the mimetic imagery of the slipperiness of the world in which there is sand and wind and waves. And the suggestion that, in fact, the one who speaks with authority speaks from the place of betrayal, of being denied, of being handed over. How does that interrupt our complicity? For me, this is very personal. I attempt to be a truth teller in my own church, the Catholic Church, on LGBT issues. This is a bit of a fool's errand, really, but it seems to be worthwhile doing it, so I carry on doing it for good measure. But a good deal of it is learning how to be a no one. It's learning how not to be listened to, how to be discounted, how to lose any sense of gratification from being thought to be a good person. And isn't that at the center of what we're being asked to do? Breaking out of the difficulty of the gratification of being thought to be a good person, so that we can recognize our sisters and brothers on their way out. And because of that, find ourselves actually hearing my voice and following me, not my James Allison's voice, of course, hearing the Lord's voice and following him. Anyhow, I wanted to throw those out as introductory words in the hopes that you will all get back to us and that we can have an animated discussion. Does that seem a good idea?
perhaps we should take a few seconds for you to able put your thoughts down, and we'll collect them and hopefully be able to respond to your queries and confusion, perhaps. And Can you see? Nothing on that one.
Are you going to moderate questions?
Yes, thank you. Shall I go? Well, we have one question here that says, can you tell me something of Girard's own faith journey? Was he like C.S. Lewis? Now, which of us is going to volunteer to do that?
James.
Yes, yes. Well, René he was born in Avignon in France in 1923. His father was the curator of the museum of the Palais des Papes, the papal palace from the time of the Avignon exile of the papacy. So he was brought up in a, I think that he would describe his mother was quite a fervent Catholic, but he himself, for him, it was much of a cultural thing at that time in his life, and he paid no particular attention to it. He began to write a book, the book which came out as Deceit, Desire and the Novel, in I think 1959, as a result of lectures he'd been giving on books. And as he wrote it, it was quite clear, and it's quite clear now to anybody who reads that book, where it's leading. But as it happened, what really struck him as he took a train on, is it called the Line? I think it goes out from Philadelphia to sort of Bryn Mawr and the main line in Philadelphia. I forget which of those schools he was giving adjunct lectures to. He had some sort of potentially cancerous blob, and for much of Lent, in one particularly, as it were, it took a long time for the biopsy to be done and to declare. So he suddenly found himself, at that stage, aged in his late 30s, faced with mortality, and described his conversion experience as something happening to him during those train journeys, as he became aware of his mortality. But then you can see it in the book. You can see that as the book develops, there's a stronger and stronger sense of there being what I call another other. Not just the social other, but a dimension to the possibility of desire, which at that early stage he called metaphysical desire, which I don't think was a very helpful term, in which he later ditched. But it was that brought him back to the faith of his mother, and as he said at that time. So he had his children baptized at that stage and started being a regular practitioner at Mass. And indeed, at least when I saw him in Stanford, he was quite regularly. He was a Eucharistic minister in the chaplaincy parish where he was. And then later in life, when the chaplaincy parish was a little bit further away, he attended a Gregorian Mass because he enjoyed the singing in Latin. It wasn't a Tridentine Mass; it was the Gregorian Mass with the Paul VI liturgy, but with the main parts in Latin, not the Gospel or the preaching. So that was something of his journey. By the time he, apparently when he was writing Violence and the Sacred, he had quite a struggle with himself not to make it much longer and include what he had begun to intuit about the Jewish-Christian thing. But eventually he decided to keep that for another book and just let the pre-Jewish-Christian thing stand by itself. And then, curiously, in the space in between those two books, he received correspondence from Father Schwager, Austrian Jesuit, who, having read Violence and the Sacred, immediately saw where it was going and sought to enter communications with him. And there then began a very fecund correspondence, which influenced Girard in all sorts of ways. Father Schwager last died very young, in 2004. So that dialogue was interrupted long before it need have been. But does that give some sort of answer to that question?
I suppose this is a question, perhaps, Duncan, that you might respond to, which is that how would Girard respond to notions of just war theory or movements like Pax Christi that we have in the church's tradition?
Okay, so some thoughts on this. In some ways, over the last 2,000 years, we've lived in a place between. At one level, we live in a world in which the reality of the scapegoat and our reliance on violence has been made absolutely clear. And at another level, we live in a world in which we're still struggling to keep order. And Girard, I suppose, in his writing talks about that, if you like, the inbreaking of this message, the evangelical message, the message of the gospel, is not something that happened for the world quickly. It happened with a small group of people in a small place on the edge, and it has taken, even till now, to come to full fruition. And so, from the very beginning of the church, of Christianity, there has been a very strong intuition, which is "thou shalt not kill." There is a profundity to that, and when the centre of the story is a crucifixion and about violence, the truth is that it can't be erased. It cannot be erased. And at the same time, we have wrestled with how do we keep the world in order while this revelation is coming through? How do we keep this through? And so I suppose we developed rules to say that we have not known how to find back to each other in certain points. We haven't known how to do it. And that, if you like, we've lived with something which was developed with huge amount of thought, the just war theory, a theory of, well, how do we cope with the fact that there's Hitler and we're sitting there, and I'm using him as a very modern example, and what do we do about these things when he's already murdering hundreds of people? What do we do about these things? These are incredibly complex realities. I suppose the truth is that space, that room to, if you like, continue to do what we were doing, even if it was now in bad conscience, is gradually being taken away from us. The last book that Girard, Battling to the End, talks about the escalation of this logic to the point that war itself is almost becoming a redundant tool. That the attempt to solve violence through violence now ends up creating almost more violence. We end ourselves in this loop. The arrival of the nuclear bomb, I suppose, was the moment at which it became clear that were we to use it, we would find ourselves destroying ourselves in the same way. And while at one level or other the mutual escalation to the point where everybody knew that held us in check for another 40 years in the Cold War, even that now has disappeared because it's coming at us from the side as technology is moving us in even more complicated directions. So we find ourselves now in a political world in which every time we try to use violence to solve our problems of violence, we end up with at least as much as was there in the first place. And the challenge, this is why I think it becomes intensely practical. For me, the point is not to stand in judgment of those who try to protect, but the point is nevertheless that the time in which this brought the possibility of social peace is disappearing on us now. We are at an existential moment for humanity. Now, a lot of people didn't like Girard's last book, the Battling to the End book, because it's very extreme. It's very extreme, but essentially he says this: we're now actually getting to the point where it really either is we stop this or we go as humanity. That actually the choices of a little bit of violence to sort it out or a limited amount are increasingly becoming impossible for us. And so the gospel moment, something which I suppose even Christians have been very, very uncertain about, the absolute knife of we're on the side of the victims or we're victimizing, is becoming more and more practically in front of us. The risk, of course, is that we go out in the street and try to fight the warriors to stop, and we escalate. This is precisely the difficulty. This is when people say to you, how practical is this? Because where I live, the bottom line is that in the world that we live in, the only order that's been brought has been by at least some attempt to create law, to create frameworks, to use some kind of basic frameworks within which we can all live. So it's not about judgment of that. It is to say, however, that the revolution in the end is not just getting the right structure or the right law or the right institution. Peace now is only makeable if we come into relationship with the victim. This is intensely practical now. This is intensely practical because we live in an apocalyptic era. We live in an apocalyptic era. And so who we are, and that actually then, funny enough, this re-empowers us, because it isn't the way in which the possibility of freedom and forgiveness comes into the world is not necessarily the province only of political leaders. It is the province of every person. That the opportunity, if that's where the revolution has to happen, if that is the possibility that we have to now live with, that our ways of doing things, it is actually not simply that we look at politics and say the politicians should do this. It is, in what way does love come into the world? Jesus did not overpower the Roman Empire. Jesus doesn't come in and set off. In fact, there's a whole big discussion going on in the whole of the New Testament about the extent to which you should collude with the empire and the extent to which, and accept it, and the extent to which you should oppose it. And he tries to find a totally other way, which is we have to change the way in which we are with each other. This is now a different type of revolution. So that doesn't absolutely answer your question, but it says to me, Girard is trying to say, this is now existentially vital for us, because we live in a period in which if we don't find our way around this and we continue to rely on violence, that the boomerang effect and the consequences of that are so great that we will find ourselves in ever greater loops.
Can I add something? Can I add something to that? One of the things that Girard was often criticised for from strictly pacifist thinkers like Stanley Hauerwas Walter Wink and others, was that he wasn't a pacifist. And they said, how, given that you understand the way violence works, how is it that you are not strictly a pacifist? And I think that Girard's answer to that question comes most clear actually in his last book, The Battling to the End, where he points out something which Lao Tzu, the person who wrote The Art of War, is that what the book's called? Yeah. The Art of War, and which Clausewitz, whose own book on war clearly followed, had understood, which is that to be completely pacifist is not to be non-violent. It's in fact to be culpably tempting violent people to exercise their violence. And that therefore there's actually, it's much more admirable, as it were, to lose the puritanical, if you like, self-righteousness of being completely pacifist, and start to develop cunning ways to give the impression that you're prepared to be violent even when you really don't want to be. So a certain cunning in that sense was something which he rather appreciated. Does that make sense? I think the example which I think of in the, do you remember in The Wire, the series The Wire? Did any of you see that? Some of you would have seen it at least. Well, there was the attempt by the cop to set up Amsterdam. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He, faced with people who wanted a war on drugs, and with the realization that it was never going to work, he attempted to create a zone of tolerance in the middle of Baltimore, which of course eventually fell foul of the politicians and everybody else. But it was the cunning of someone who was trying to do something that appeared not to be good, but was in fact much better than any of the alternatives, which can only be done by somebody who's prepared to lose their self-regard as, I'm the good guy. Does that make sense?
Yep, and even coming back at it again, because I think it's absolutely right, which is that the way in which, as I understand it, Jesus come into the world is not by a process of political action against the bad guys, but reveal and convert. The question is that we are met. What stops us being violent is the moment when we understand that that's exactly what we are being. And so the critical issue is not how do I get all excited about these bad guys who are doing violence. It is how do we make it possible to reveal what it is we are doing to each other, so that at some level or other we have to stop.
If you are not a follower or a believer of Jesus, how do you break the mimetic cycle, for example, an atheist? Who would like that one?
Right, so I'm speaking, but I'll let James start, but I'm happy enough to say something on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's absolutely no doctrinal content to breaking the mimetic cycle. It's really interesting that the example which Jesus himself gives at the very end of the bits of St. Matthew that I've just been talking about is the parable of the sheep and the goats. And in the parable of the sheep and the goats, it's absolutely unnecessary to have believed in Jesus. It's whether or not you were found reaching out to those in prison or those who were naked or those who were poor. That itself. You are moving away from security and towards precariousness. That is already the sign that you're beginning to stand on the rock. There's absolutely no sense in that parable that, and yes, you have to sign up to a doctrinal package. And I think that, as is perfectly obvious to at least many Christians, we are constantly being put to shame by people who have no particular doctrinal framework, and yet manage to do marvelous things marvelously without much self-conscience. I mean, I don't know whether you remember when there was an assault going on at the Jewish supermarket in Paris over a year ago. Do you remember the terrorists the terrorists locked a whole lot of people downstairs, and one of the assistants hid them in the fridge. And he was a small Malian, so from Mali, Muslim young boy who was, one of the guys who helps put your stuff into paper bags at the cash-out line. And when he saw what was going on, he shut them all into the fridge, went round, found the place where he could turn the heat, the freezing bit off in case they had to stay there for a long time. And then he knew of another way out. So he went to open the other way out, which is round the back, and started getting people out the other way out. But of course, the first thing that the cops did when they saw this Malian person was immediately to arrest him because he looked like a terrorist. And in fact, he had been the person who saved a lot of lives. And when he was interviewed afterwards, he appeared to have no self-consciousness at all that he had done something both very, very brave and well beyond, as it were, the call of his duty. He'd just done what had to be done in that moment. We have no particular indication that he was a very practicing Muslim, but I mean, what it would be to have been in that situation and to have got it right. Dear Lord, I would give many years of my life to be able to have been in the situation and got something right for once, and not even really to have thought about it.
We possibly in America even more so because of the huge importance of the Enlightenment here, but we're at the end of a period in which we think religion is a series of propositions. We think faith is a series of intellectual things you tick. I'm an atheist, I believe in this, I don't. I tried to say to you, Girard, even if you don't think you're following something, you are following something. And so the risk, of course, of this is because we don't want to recognise it, we actually pretend then we're all autonomous and I'm just doing my own thing, when in fact we're following some really dangerous things. That is the enormously risky thing. The question is never, is there a God? It's who is your God? The banning in the Hebrew Scriptures is of idolatry, in other words, having another God. That's the problem. It's you're either following this one or we're all doing things which are valid. Now, so I want to say that in the line of what James said, at some level or other, for me personally, what is unbelievably fantastic is something that I received actually in a very living way in my family, has started to make incredible sense. So it's a language of simplicity. That what the gospel talks about, what James was talking about, to me, makes these things clear with an incredible simplicity and clarity once you start to see it happening. So that's the value of it. But faith is who hears the voice of the victim and reacts and responds to that mimetically. And who is taking us out of that space. And in that sense, there may be, as James said, we have to, this is the difference between saying everybody has to become a Christian, and for me, as my language, which says everybody has to follow the Lord in Jesus. They may not always be the same thing. In fact, it may be sometimes the exact opposite. That because we believe we're Christian, we are the good guys, we go around battering everybody on the head, and at that very moment the Lord is with the people who we're battering on the head. The classic example of this is, where was God in Auschwitz? And God was with the Jewish people in Auschwitz. Absolutely. Absolutely. He certainly wasn't with the Christians who were blessing the wagons. He certainly wasn't. And just because you say Lord, Lord, as the language says, doesn't actually identify anything. The question of what faith is, mimetically, is who is following the voice of the victim. And that is a visible thing. It's a physical thing. It is a mimetic thing, not an intellectual thing in your head. It's not a statement of dogma.
Any anti-idolater, and one would hope that an atheist is an anti-idolater, sees this. I think that's...
And of course, the great risk of our society is that actually Nietzsche, I mean, Girard was a Nietzschean until he became a Christian. And because he came to the conclusion that some of these things, these denials, were taking us back into the notion that we get everywhere by violence. The Superman is the person who will take us to the future. And in many ways, some of these things which go by atheism are that. And yet so many of my friends who become atheists are atheists, in fact, because they believe that the so-called loving of the church is spoken but not real. It's an experience of having been persecuted, not of having been saved. And that is something we who still want to talk in Christian terms need to take seriously. Not to dismiss, but to take seriously.
We have some wonderful questions here, but regrettably we have limits of time in this room. So I've chosen one which is a very frequent question, which I think might be a very good one to end upon. If human consciousness is entirely structured by or identical with mimesis, what does it mean to break out of mimetic desire or rivalry? How does Girard account for this? Would you like to begin, James?
Yes. I think the notion of breaking out of mimetic desire would, I think, be catastrophic. We would cease to become humans at all. We would just, we would be jabbering. It's that we are empowered to imitate others that has enabled us to take on board what makes us human. It's inducted us into humanity. Now, our learning to separate for ourselves that which is grasping and acquiring identity over against others through imitation, and that which is the kind of imitation which is something which enables us to receive ourselves without grasping from other people, is what the experience of loving and being loved is all about, as I think as everyone knows. You are able to emulate without fear that you're going to enter into rivalry. And this is something that has to be worked at over time. So the notion that we can, little by little and with great difficulty, learn not to be grasping in our patterns of desire doesn't make us any less mimetic. It usually means it makes us more aware of how fragile our virtues, such as they are, might be. But it also allows us to receive who we are much more richly than we would have received if we were merely grasping. So I think that he has ultimately, mimesis is not, as it were, a good or a bad thing. It's simply something that is. That's how we function as humans. We are much better imitators than our nearest simian relatives. That's it. We are better monkeys. Or worse, we're better equipped monkeys with mirror neurons. But this just gives us much more responsibility in terms of learning how to distinguish between when we are being summoned into rivalry and when, in fact, we can let go of rivalry and allow ourselves to receive who we are over time through the regard of each other in love. Which is the work of how not only a marriage is built up, but how any friendship is built up, and how any community of believers, a religious community, a church, a parish, or whatever, is built up, a synagogue. As we learn that we are able to receive who we are gratuitously, over time, at the hands of someone who loves us and doesn't mind our shortcomings, and that as we receive that, we find ourselves able to live up to it. That's, as it were, mimesis positively. Girard was not very keen on, how would we say, very sort of romantic notions of, now I'm going to become a great positive imitator. Because usually those who want suddenly to become positive imitators usually fall flat on their nose at the first offence. And actually, one of the classic examples is St. Ignatius, who set off wanting to be a greater, first of all, he wanted to be greater than all the knights of chivalry, and then he wanted to be greater than St. Francis and St. Dominic. Boom, flat on the nose. And then the process is actually learning over time how to separate the wheat from the chaff and become a desirer who is essentially a recipient, someone who's dependent. Does that make sense?
But I'd just like to add to that as Duncan so well pointed out, the great romantic myth, of course, is the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, when the reality is I am, therefore you are, therefore I am. Right? It is through others that we are called into being. And that itself is not an idea, but our intersubjectivity is an objective reality. It's the way things are. Right? So to describe human beings as mimetic is to describe the sky as blue. Right? And why that is so scandalous to us is because if we inhabit that truth, then we immediately come to see our own complicity, right, in the violence that is done in the world, right? And this further requires us to be utterly vulnerable. It reveals us as dependent, right, on one another, and certainly for a theist, ultimately on God, right? So the place for the Christian who has arrived at the end of the Girardian, the 3 steps of the Girardian insight, is at the foot of the cross, right? Pleading for the grace to be held in this reality.
Follow that. I'm going to finish with good Protestantism because I'm a Protestant, a dirty Protestant. This question very directly is, as I said, as I try to experience it, says, don't think of mimesis as an idea. Think of it as a way to try to describe the gravitational pull we have for each other. It is a magnetic reality. It's something in physics or biology. It's not something that's in our ideas. You don't stop being mimetic because you say I'm not mimetic. We are mimetic anyway. It's just part of what human beings are. We learn from each other. We engage with each other. We change and we develop. And thank God for it, because anybody who's had a traumatic background, their only possibility is to come into mimesis with some other reality in their lives which gives them some possibility of change. If you want to read the book, the story is all about the temporal realities we carry with us meeting the spatial possibilities of freedom we have all the time. So the world is not shut. Our being in our past is not our end, because there is always the possibility that we come into another spatial, mimetic relationship now, which changes us. In a good way and a bad way. We could also be in a terrible crash, or something could happen to our relatives, or we could end up in some horrific situation from which we never recover. So these things can all happen to us, and they happen to us without our thought. They happen to us because we are mimetic and in the middle of the circumstances. The biblical language, and this is where I'm getting Protestant, is of being born again. And we run away from this language because we are now so worried about it being a violent imposition on us and being told we have to be born again, instead of it being this massive possibility that instead of being people who are enthralled to violence and all the things in the past about having to struggle for power, having to struggle for our being, there is the possibility that we stop, that we come into relationship with another reality which holds us, and which, in a very literal sense to me, saves us from the mess that we would otherwise be in. So that language of the evangelicals, which for me is so distorted, because it becomes so violent and so aggressive, I want to reclaim it as absolutely accurate. It is the possibility of a new start as a small child who knows nothing but is being brought into a new mimetic reality which saves us literally, from the alternative, which is this terrible apocalypse. So this is good news, children. This is good news. However, I want to say one last thing, which is this, which is the attempt that we make now to say, I'm going to be not mimetic with somebody else. I'm an individual. I don't have this. The paradox of it is, the more we try to be individual, the more the same we become, because we spend all our time fighting each other and we become all similar in our fighting. The mimetic relationships in which we live are all unique. Each of us is unique. We do not have to worry about that. And the paradox is, if we try to make it so unique that we are an individual, we become less unique. So our society destroys the huge variety of creativity and diversity of who we are and makes us all have to become individuals. What a mess.
Thank you all very much, and I'm so sorry we couldn't get to so many of these questions, but we can continue the discussion at the back there. Thank you.
Very much.
Good.